Now that Saw 10 has been out for a couple of weeks, I thought it was the perfect time to revisit it and take a closer look at the good, the bad, and the downright awesome. Hi guys, I hope you're doing really well. My name is Sarah and welcome to What the Horror, the channel where we talk about horror movies, old and new. So, I had an absolute nightmare trying to name this episode because I don't really want to say what the film did right and wrong. I mean, who am I to sit here and say what the creative team behind this film did right and wrong? It's their creation. However, in today's episode we are going to be thinking and talking about the strengths and weaknesses of Saw 10. The things that worked and were well received by fans, and the things that didn't work as well and that seemed to be a miss with fans. Just a heads up that this episode will contain spoilers, so bear that in mind if you haven't seen the film yet. If you haven't seen the film yet and would like to know my thoughts on it, then I will leave a link to my spoiler-free episode here and in the description box. If you have already seen my review on Saw 10 or you follow me on Letterboxd, then you will know that I absolutely loved this film. I was riding on such a high after watching it for days afterwards. And as many of you will know by now, I just love the Saw franchise, with the original being one of my favourite horror films or just films of all time. And I know that a lot of you share that love, as my channel has had a recent surge in subs due to some of the Saw-based episodes that I've done over the last few months. So I'm always happy to talk about these films, and I hope that you guys are still enjoying the Saw content as well. Because of my love of Saw 10 and the franchise, I'll be honest that there are going to be far more things that it did well than not. But I am a realist, and Saw 10 is not a perfect film. So there are a couple of things that we'll get into that were not done as well. And a bit of a disclaimer, most of those things were brought to my attention by my own wonderful subs. If you're new here and found me through this episode and also love the Saw franchise or just horror in general, then why not hit the subscribe button and join the What the Horror family. I'll also leave a link to my other Saw content for you to check out after this episode. Okay, so let's get into it, starting off with the positives. Let's take a look at the things that Saw 10 did well, and exceptionally well. Number one is bringing the focus back onto John Kramer, the franchise's main antagonist. What's interesting about this character is that in the original film, we barely saw John Kramer, except for a few seconds in a hospital scene with Lawrence Gordon. He then spent the majority of the film's runtime laying on the floor pretending to be a dead body. And as for Jigsaw, he was more of a lingering presence, lurking in the shadows and hidden in the background. But always present throughout the film through the traps, the colours red and green, and of course the incredible vocals on the tapes that act as milestones through the story. One of the biggest strengths of Saw 2 was the fact that we got much more time with John and Jigsaw, seeing him as Jigsaw, but also digging more into why and how he became Jigsaw. Because of the character's death at the end of Saw 3 for the remainder of the franchise, the films had to resort to flashbacks and memory recalls to be able to include John in the story, in the films. Sometimes this worked really well, sometimes it didn't, and even occasionally bordered on the silly. But as a Saw fan, I can't deny that any appearance was appreciated, them often being a highlight of the film. After the original film was released, audiences really latched onto two things: the traps and Jigsaw, and I think in equal measure because of how he was written by Leigh Whannell and how he was portrayed by Tobin Bell. In Saw 10, we get so much more time with John Kramer, especially considering this is the Saw film with the longest runtime. The film spends a huge amount of this runtime just following John outside of his life as Jigsaw. We follow him go for checkups at the hospital, we follow him attending a support group, we even follow him just hanging out in a cafe. We see more of his day-to-day life, we see him as John rather than Jigsaw. This gives audiences, I believe, the most human version of this character. It's not about his myth and legend after he's gone. It's not about his notoriety as a serial killer. It's about him being human and vulnerable. You know, Jigsaw is this scary bad guy. He's smart and always one step ahead. He's brutal with his lessons, but he's also ill, vulnerable, and just desperately looking for hope. It sets up a very emotional connection between the audience and the character. In Saw X, we now no longer just have Jigsaw, the antagonist, but also John Kramer, the anti-hero. A lot of the emotion comes not only from the writing, but also from Tobin Bell's performance. Bell is a Shakespearean trained actor and is able to deliver so much in his eyes and facial expressions alone, especially in the scene where John returns to the villa only to find it abandoned. As you watch him realise that he has been conned, that the tumour hasn't gone, it's actually heartbreaking. It's also interesting to see his relationships with other characters. We see him bond with people, we see acts of kindness towards other people, and see him want to reward acts of kindness from others. I love the relationship between John and the young boy. I forget his name, but he has quite a parental element to him, and it's sad to see him be so good with children. Except for being responsible for them ending up in a trap, of course, and just thinking how different things would have been had he and Jill not lost their baby. Number 2 is giving us more of John and Amanda's relationship. Amanda Young has always been a fan favourite, and many people seem to have connected with this complex character and her struggles throughout the films. Like with John, we didn't get a lot of time with the character in the original film, but she instantly made a huge mark on it, appearing in one of, if not the most famous trap. In Saw 2, we got the return of Amanda, but of trap survivor Amanda, until the shock twist in the finale that she was actually one of Jigsaw's apprentices. But it wasn't until Saw 3 that they really started to explore John and Amanda's relationship, the dynamic between them, why she had become his apprentice, and the almost unhealthy attachment Amanda had to John. This point though, Amanda's mental health was already deteriorating. She had already become disillusioned with John's philosophy and had taken it upon herself to change the game rules by making her traps unwinnable. While we've had flashbacks that have shown us a little more of their relationship, I feel like Saw X hit that sweet spot between us knowing she's Jigsaw's apprentice and her downward spiral. This is, in my opinion, one of the strongest portrayals of Amanda and most interesting and engaging time in her and John's relationship. At this point, Amanda still seems to be on board with John's philosophy and follows instructions from him. They're still very close and there is an evident reliance on him still from Amanda, but we also get this feisty, sharp-tongued version of Amanda who is very self-confident and a person to be reckoned with in her own right. But it was one of my subs who actually pointed out that in Saw X we could actually be seeing the start of Amanda pulling away from and questioning John's teachings. Their reasoning was that Amanda sees Cecilia's relentlessness and heartlessness, which could lead Amanda to believe people just can't be saved. But I wondered if the catalyst went deeper than that. I mean, think about it. Amanda connects with Gabriella because of her being a drug addict. She tries to speak to John about Gabriella being in the trap, and does she really need or deserve to be there? She tries to explain that sometimes people find themselves in situations where they have no control, but John's response is that Gabriella made a choice, and so is responsible. But this is obviously going to hit a chord with Amanda, seeing as how it's the same exact reason why she ended up in her trap. But despite Amanda trying to help her, and despite her remaining in the trap, Gabriella survives her game, but only to be ultimately killed by Cecilia. So Gabriella winning, and so by John's logic learning to value her life, got her nowhere. It got her dead. While Cecilia definitely deserves to be in the trap, yet survives, and who knows if she learnt anything. To Amanda, this could appear as a perfect display of how John's philosophy doesn't work, and could be considered pointless. Number 3 is the return of Amanda Young and Mark Hoffman. We've already talked about Amanda's relationship with John, but just bringing Amanda and Hoffman back is a strength in itself. I can't think about this film or bits of this film without smiling. Man, I am such a sucker for fan service. Get it together, Sarah. Along with Jigsaw and Billy the Puppet, these two characters are major staples of the Saw franchise, especially the Roman numeral films. the better films. By including these two, it instantly makes it feel more like a Saw film and makes the fans happy, which is never a bad thing. But it takes more than just including a character to work. They have to be used well, and I think Saw 10 utilised these two perfectly. Amanda is used as John's right-hand man and muscle, and we know from previous films that she likes to be right there in the mix when it comes to John's work and traps. And she also has a heavy reliance on him as her support, so it works that she's following him around the world and capturing his trap victims, just like she did with Adam for the Saw 3 trap. As for Mark Hoffman, his role may have been very small, but again, he was used perfectly. Hoffman is at this point in the timeline still a detective in the police force, and it would look a little sus if he just upped sticks and headed out to Mexico and like, see you guys, off on a trip. But he is also still an integral part of the Jigsaw team, and John is still relying on him for help in other ways. So we get John calling Hoffman asking for some long distance help, using his police skills to locate people for the traps. The credit scene is where the most fun is had though. Sure, it's probably a little bit more of fan service than actual storytelling, as Henry doesn't seem to have an actual choice or chance to get out of his trap, but do we care? No. Well, I don't anyway. I don't. But it's great to have Hoffman back by John's side, and there's the added aspect of him almost gloating over beating this con man whilst in the bathroom, the room we all know he ultimately ends up in himself. I also mentioned in my Saw 10 review that you can just tell how much fun Costa Mandalore is having in the role, as well as Shawnee Smith with Amanda, and it just adds to the enjoyment to see the actors enjoying themselves too. Number 4 is the decision to make Saw 10 a prequel. Of course, none of the above would have been possible without the choice to make Saw 10 a prequel. You guys may have seen that Zach from Cesi's World and I did an episode looking at the unanswered questions left open in the Saw franchise. Oh boy, did we miss the marker with that one, because we thought the logical choice was for them to just make Saw 10 the next in a long line of entries, perhaps addressing these questions, but instead they chose to take it back to the early days. And in doing so, they were able to do all of the above that we've talked about. This creative choice and the success of it has also opened up many more possibilities, as they can now play with the idea of making more prequels as well as sequels. Number 5 is returning to the style of the earlier Saw films. Another thing Saw 10 did well through choosing to make it a prequel is by stripping it all back to basics and returning to the form of the earlier Saw films. Director of photography Nick Matthews said at the Saw panel of Midsummer Scream that he and Kevin Grutert felt it was important to pay homage to the early Saw films in terms of textures and colour palettes, that they wanted to throw the audience into a, quote, graphic, gritty world, end quote. I've noticed a few people comment on the sometimes slow pace of the story, and especially the dialogue and character-driven scenes between traps, but I mentioned in my review that I think that by doing that, they are taking it back to basics. They're stripping it back to what the original film was. That was two guys in one room talking and interacting, with the odd trap scene or investigation scene breaking it up. Now, don't get me wrong, I love how daft and convoluted the franchise becomes. I have fun with it. But it does go down a different route after Saw 3, and there is just something about those first 3 films that it's enjoyable as a Saw fan to feel like we're really revisiting that period of time. Okay, now let's take a look at what didn't work as well in Saw 10, because like I said earlier, it's not a perfect film. Nearly, but not quite. Number 1 is choosing to make Saw 10 a prequel. Yes, I know that that is a huge contradiction, and I know I have just been trying to convince you that it was actually a strength of the film, but hear me out. By making this a prequel in John and Amanda's story, we know what happens to these characters. We know their ending. And so when John and Amanda are outsmarted by Cecilia and Parker and placed in chains to then be placed in traps, we know as an audience that they will ultimately win and get out. Saw 10 being a prequel removes any tension or stakes when it comes to the fate of John and Amanda. To me, this doesn't mean it's not worth making it a prequel. It's simply the price you pay for that choice. Number 2 is Saw X's runtime of nearly 2 hours. Saw X is the longest Saw film to date, coming in at 118 minutes, overtaking Saw 3. Now, does it need to be nearly 2 hours? No. This is a story that could quite easily be trimmed down to an hour 30 or an hour 45. I never felt like the film dragged, but I do think some scenes could be seen as filler scenes, and you could trim them to make it a tighter runtime. It is beyond me why we have this new obsession with making movies 2 hours, 3 hours long. As much as we love movies, we don't all have time to dedicate that amount of time to a single film. Now, the next 2 weaknesses are actually ones brought to my attention by my own lovely subs. Number 3 is the close call traps. This first one, quite a few people seem to have been annoyed by, and that is what we're going to call the close call traps. And by that I mean Valentina and Mateo's. For both of these, we watch as the character goes through the pain and torment of the trap, to have essentially completed the trap only to fail by mere seconds. I do understand that by doing this, we the audience get to see the character complete the test, but then we also get to see the end result of the trap in action. We get the gore and the suspense. We've seen this happen before, we've seen traps fail, but for it to be such a close call seems a little mean on the character. And I think what people seemed to have an issue with is the fact that this happens twice. It feels like a little bit of a cop-out. Number 4 is the fact that John Kramer fell for a con. This is John Kramer. From day one, we have been told that he is highly intelligent, he's astute, he can read people, and is usually 3 steps ahead of them. We've watched him film after film play cat and mouse with people, always coming out on top in the end. Until his death, obviously. And now in Saw X, here, he is taken in and conned by this group of people. How believable is that? Based on what we've previously seen, not very. Especially considering that, how do I put this? Aside from Cecilia, most of the people involved in the con are not of high intelligence, but rather chancers making use of an opportunity. Cecilia is the only one who has the brains to really pull it off. But I think it's important to consider where John is in his life in Saw X. He's sick, grieving, and desperately looking for hope, for a way to save his life. I think that makes it far more believable that he would fall for the con, because he's vulnerable. But playing devil's advocate, the next step in the timeline is Saw 2, and that is a perfect example of his sharp mind and cat and mouse game. So I guess it's really up to you to decide if it's something Saw 10 did well or not. Do you believe that John Kramer would fall for a con? Well, those are the strengths and weaknesses of Saw 10, only according to moi. Of course, this is all subjective, but let me know in the comments below what you feel are the strengths and weaknesses with the film. What do you think Saw 10 did right and wrong? Always be kind though if you're responding to someone else's opinions and thoughts. We're all allowed our own opinion without being attacked for it. But I look forward to hearing your take on the film. If you enjoyed this episode, then hit the like button, as it really helps the channel and pleases the YouTube overlords. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any other What the Horror content. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, try not to fall for any cons, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye!